Welcome to the National Decommissioning Research Initiative panel session. Today we're talking about the role of research in supporting good decision making and outcomes for decommissioning. My name's Renae Larsen, I'm the Program Director for NDRI, and we've got some great speakers coming up for this session today. Just give you a little bit of an overview of the session and the panel speakers. Today we've got myself providing a little bit of background, followed by David Christensen, Director or now Executive Director at NOPSEMA. And I'll provide a little bit more of a background to each of the speakers before they come up for their session. Stephanie Claydon from Woodside as Environmental Advisor in Decommissioning, and Darren Koppel from Australian Institute of Marine Science, research scientist and environmental risk assessment expert. So thank you, speakers, for joining me today on this panel. We'll each present a little bit of background on the area from the regulatory perspective, from the title holder and from research, and then we'll sit down for a little bit of a discussion for 15 to 20 minutes at the end, and we'll open it to questions at the end as well. So just to touch on a little bit of the background, the legislation in Australia requires title holders to develop acceptable plans for removal of offshore infrastructure with a base case of full removal. Alternative options to leave in situ, this can be partial removal, augmentation or repurposing of infrastructure, does require impacts and risks to be reduced to as low as reasonably practicable and align with principles of ecologically sustainable development. So this is in contrast to our friends in the Northern Hemisphere. The legislation is a little bit different up there, and I've just listed a few dot points here around the differences that you'll see in Australia in terms of decommissioning activity. We're in the infancy here, and we're trying to establish that decommissioning industry, and that's part of CODA's role in that space. There's certainly a huge variability in environmental factors when you're looking at Northern Hemisphere versus Southern Hemisphere considerations. So, you know, there's also little precedents set for leave in situ as well. We're looking at tropical and temperate environments, impacts from cyclone activity and those sort of considerations that we're looking at in Australia. There's also that different regulatory, economic, social and cultural landscape to consider. And on top of that, the potential risks, impacts and benefits are not really well understood in an Australian context. So that's an important differentiator from the Northern Hemisphere. And that's why we need to sort of establish a knowledge base in Australia that fits the operations and the areas that we're working in, and making sure we're applying it appropriately. So in terms of research, we've identified that there's a real need to address key knowledge gaps associated with decommissioning options to ensure guidance, assessment framework, the tools and policies are underpinned with robust science and data, and for research priorities to be addressed holistically. So that's looking at transparent and collaborative engagement across regulatory, research, title holders and other stakeholders in that space, and that's important in any industry really. And the real goal is to integrate this knowledge base into planning and decision for future developments as well. So it's not just about what's in place now. Let's try and integrate this knowledge and learning into future projects, including offshore wind, and apply some of those learnings across industry, outside of the oil and gas industry as well. So in terms of a bit of background about NDRI, the role of NDRI is really to set out to build that knowledge base on behalf of industry for Australia, to reduce the uncertainty in this space and to support stakeholders in building the right decision-making tools and basing their decisions on solid, robust science. So NDRI was established in 2019 by 8 different oil and gas operators to address those knowledge gaps, potential impacts, risks and benefits of decommissioning on the marine environment. In phase 1, there were 7 research projects that were undertaken, and you can see on the slide here we've addressed areas of habitat value, connectivity, invasive marine species, material degradation, contaminants of primary concern, and it's really just touched on building some of that knowledge base in Australia. All of the work is available on the NDRI website. It's open access, and that's really important for NDRI in terms of making sure that every stakeholder has access to this and can apply it in the context of their role and their decision making. So certainly haven't built that comprehensive base of knowledge yet, but we're working on it, and we're just one of the initiatives that are looking at that, and interest is certainly growing in Australia to continue to build that knowledge base in these areas. In terms of phase 2, at the end of phase 1, NDRI sort of took a step back and said, well, now we've addressed some of those initial concerns and filled some knowledge gaps here. Let's complete a research roadmap. And the objective of this was to define some of the priority research questions and knowledge gaps which differentiate Australia from the rest of the world. So in doing so, Curtin University led this research, and they engaged 61 different stakeholders nationally across industry, research, government, fisheries, non-government organisations, and built some focus groups around that, which then produced a set of 23 priority research questions, which were then ranked independently. And this, what rose to the top, which was quite obvious, the top 5 priorities centred around identification, characterisation, fate, and impact of contaminants. So that was a real priority for everyone, and I think that's quite an obvious one for decommissioning, as well as in operations. So this now forms the basis of the phase 2 NDRI current research. In terms of timeframes and who's working with us on phase 2, this is running until 2026. We've now got 6 participants for phase 2. Chevron, ExxonMobil, Santos, Shell, Vermilion and Woodside are involved. The Centre of Decommissioning is that governance body that supports us in that space, and it's really important to have that transparency aspect to it, as well as a separate independent scientific advisory board that adds that extra layer of governance around that, and it's modelled on a similar framework in the UK from a group called Insight, which do similar research for the Northern Hemisphere. So in terms of phase 2, some of the key focuses include developing an industry guideline for assessing key contaminants, specifically NORMS and mercury, including risk criteria and methods for assessing the long-term fate of these contaminants. And you'll hear a bit more about this from Darren shortly. Also looking at the identification assessment of additional contaminants, so just building that information on what's out there, specifically on the rigid pipelines. Some of the coatings on some of these export pipelines are proprietary limited, specifically the polymers and things like that. So when they were installed, the constituents are still unknown, so that's about going back retrospectively and trying to understand what are the potential contaminants we're working with and how do we address these. In addition to that, we're looking at building a risk framework around non-metals, so plastics and other non-metals, to build a similar guideline that we are looking at for NORMS and mercury and addressing fate, pathways and ecotoxicity. So that's not a small topic. I think it's not something that's going to be addressed in the short term, but at least we can start to move in that direction and start to focus on some of those key contaminants and build that knowledge to then feed into some of these comparative assessments, risk assessments and support decision making. Lastly, we've got the scientific-based industry guideline for cleaning and in-situ measurement technology. So that's important. So when we have identified some of the aspects around these contaminants, how do we then verify the quantity that's out there, or how clean is clean for these pipelines? And is that, probably not the best term to use, acceptable, but is there a level at which we're comfortable with if we want to look at alternative decommissioning options to leave in situ and look at it against other aspects in their surrounding environment? So yes, what does this phase 2 boil down to? It's basically what contaminants are present and at what level, how will these behave over time, and can we determine some best practice criteria for evaluating the risks and impacts for these contaminants. So that's essentially what phase 2 is focusing on for NDRI. And the reason for this session today is really to talk about that collaborative aspect around how do we best approach some of these research questions. And I think it's really requires that effort between research, industry, the touch points with the policymakers, and combining and aligning on what is the best practice approach and how we can work together to develop these. So that's really what NDRI is all about, and you'll hear a little bit more from each of the speakers, and then opportunity to have some questions at the end of the session. So thank you. If you would like to find a little bit more information about NDRI, you're welcome to have a look at the website, and all of the research papers and reports can be accessed on the site. So I'll now introduce our next speaker. We've got David Christensen from NOPSEMA, and I'll just read a little bit about the bio. So David has extensive experience in environmental management, specialising in the regulation of the offshore energy industry. Within NOPSEMA, David leads a team that coordinates the regulatory oversight of title holders' compliance with their decommissioning obligations, and this includes coordinating NOPSEMA's response to regulatory reforms and implementing decommissioning compliance strategy, which is the key topic today. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. So firstly, thank you to CODA, NDRI. It's fantastic that you can facilitate such a session like this, where we start talking about uncertainty and ways in which we can address uncertainty as it relates to offshore petroleum decommissioning, because we all know that in addressing uncertainty, we'll make better decisions which will improve decommissioning outcomes for current and future generations. So today I'm just going to touch on the legal framework. I'll keep it pretty short and sweet, and then we'll just move on to some of the observations that NOPSEMA has made over the last 3 to 4 years in relation to decommissioning. We'll touch on some areas of uncertainty that we've observed, and then we'll finish on where you can find further information. All right, the legal framework. There's a range of different pieces of legislation that govern decommissioning in offshore Commonwealth waters. The one I'll be talking about is the Offshore Petroleum Greenhouse Gas Storage Act. That's Australia's principal legislation as it relates to managing petroleum activities. There's 2 key provisions that relate to decommissioning. The first is Section 572, which is a standing duty on all petroleum companies, all title holders, to fully remove all property structures when no longer in use. It's actually a very long-standing obligation. It's been in place in legislation domestically, I think, since the 60s. And the 2 key reasons that drive the requirement for full removal, firstly, is to ensure Australia complies with international conventions, protocols and treaties, and it also eliminates risk for future marine users as well. The other provision worth noting relates to the title surrender process. So this is sort of the last process in place, regulatory process in place. While NOPSEMA doesn't have a formal decision-making role, we provide advice, recommendations to the Joint Authority in relation to a number of decommissioning matters, which I've raised on the slide here. It's important for petroleum companies to be aware of these things when they're planning for decommissioning, so that they're aware of those end states, the end criteria that they need to meet in order to be able to relinquish their title. All that said, there is the ability for title holders to seek alternatives to fully remove structures, and the mechanism to do that is through the Environment Plan, which I'll touch on a little bit later. So some of the observations that we've made. So NOPSEMA has been giving heightened focus on title holder compliance with their decommissioning obligations for the last 3 to 4 years. And what we've found is that The general directions that we've issued have largely been effective. We've issued 8 general directions to title holders, petroleum companies across Australia, and it's really pleasing to see that in a number of those cases, decommissioning has actually been completed successfully without any major incidents. And the remaining cases, progress is really tracking well, and those petroleum companies are certainly likely to meet targets that have been set. What we've seen from those cases, though, is that decommissioning costs have greatly exceeded estimates. Now, I don't think this is anything that's too unique or novel to the Australian context. If you look at other jurisdictions throughout the world, it's a common trend. When you look at the way in which companies have actually undertaken the estimates, including in the late life asset phase, I think there's some room for improvement. What we've also seen is that poor decommissioning planning, failure to consider monitoring maintenance requirements will introduce many challenges that title holders and operators will have to deal with. We've also seen a number of cases, or heard a number of cases, where petroleum companies are wanting to repurpose their facilities. So I think there's roughly around 7. Now, without the supporting plans in place, without understanding structural integrity of those facilities, even understanding the economics associated with those proposals, we're certainly likely to see some negative impacts on decommissioning outcomes. As we all know, the longer the period between cessation of production and ultimate decommissioning, the greater the challenges, the greater the risk profile, and likely the greater the costs. Lastly, the sale of late life assets will continue to present some unique challenges, particularly when we start talking about incoming buyers' financial, technical capacity to be able to run those facilities safely and then ultimately decommission fields. So what is certain? Well, decommissioning is a legal requirement, and decommissioning must be completed prior to the surrender of title. Full removal is the base case. It's the expectation of NOPSEMA and government that is reflected in the plans that are being developed by petroleum companies. That consideration is given to full removal also as part of managing the finances. We know that late or poor planning will introduce many complexities and challenges, and likely introduce cost overruns as well when it comes to decommissioning. It's important also that asset repurposing strategies are worked in parallel with decommissioning planning until such time as those projects are actually endorsed and approved. What's uncertain? Well, if a company wants to leave property rather than removing it, then we do introduce a high degree of uncertainty. And I would suggest that petroleum companies really need to consider these strategies early, to start thinking about the environmental benefit proposition associated with leaving those structures in situ. Things such as, is it going to actually enhance marine ecosystems over the long term? Will it actually protect, conserve habitat, listed species? Will it maintain and enhance economic, social, cultural benefits to people and the broader community? But in all cases, it needs to be very clear that impacts and risks will be reduced to a LARP, an acceptable level and consistent with the principles of ecological sustainable development. So here's just a hit list of areas where we've seen some uncertainty. Firstly, what's the status, condition, composition of property and equipment in a tidal area? What are the activities that actually need to be performed to be able to successfully complete decommissioning? What are the data needs to then inform good decision making around decommissioning? Do we actually understand who our stakeholders are, including those in the community? Have we got a relationship with them? Do we understand their perspectives as it relates to decommissioning? So finally, there's a range of different policy and guidance that is available on NOPSEMA's website. We've got a decommissioning compliance strategy, research strategy, and a range of regulatory policies in relation to those two key provisions I mentioned. I did also just want to mention that the Australian government is working on guidance in relation to removal of oil and gas property. This has been co-developed with NOPSEMA, DQ, the sea dumping team, and also DISA as well, to provide further clarity on what property must be removed and considerations for cases where companies wish to seek approval to leave property in situ. The guidance is currently with the Minister's Office and will be out for public comment in the next month or so, and DISA will likely run some information sessions on that as well, so stay tuned. That brings me to the end of my presentation. Look forward to the panel session later.
Thanks, David. That was great. Now I'd like to introduce Stephanie Claydon, who's an environmental advisor for Woodside in decommissioning. She also sits on the National Decommissioning Research Initiative Executive Committee as well. So welcome.
Thank you, Renae, for inviting me to speak today and to provide an industry perspective on decommissioning and the important role that research can play. I would first like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the Whadjuk that we stand on here today on the Derbarl, Yerrigan, the Swan River. So it's a legal speak there. Okay, so the next slide, decommissioning approach presented here. It's pretty standard across industry. We're interested in the timely, safe and environmentally acceptable decommissioning that meets regulatory requirements and stakeholder expectations. Everyone's talking about this a lot. It's about meeting our base case for full removal of oil and gas property brought onto the tidal area and making good the seabed at the end. So for the key principles in decommissioning, early planning, well in advance of asset end of life, making evidence-based decisions underpinned by science and marine research. And the key thing we're learning is decommissioning is novel and new in Australia. We are doing it internationally, but we need to know about our Australian environments, marine systems. We need to do research to further reinforce the need to collaborate and share these learnings with other operators in Australia. So 2024 has been a really busy year for decommissioning at Woodside. We secured 6 environmental approvals in late 2023 in order to commence an integrated campaign across 4 fields, Griffin, Stybarrow, Enfield and Ecoyogal, to remove subsea equipment and large structures, including the Griffin RTM, the riser turret mooring, and the Stybarrow DTM, the disconnectable turret mooring. So this campaign alone will bring 25,000 tonnes of decommissioning waste onshore by the end of this year and early 2025, with a recycling target of above 90%. We also recently reached a key milestone for the Griffin field, completing the removal of the Griffin gas export pipeline in Commonwealth waters on the 8th of March 2024. So this is the first export pipeline in Australia in Commonwealth waters that's been removed. On the 1st of this month, we also received the Griffin Field Deviation Environmental Plan approval, and this is the first, I believe, of Woodside's to be approved as a field deviation case to leave in situ 5 piled foundations, 6 mid-depth buoys, concrete gravity bases, and best endeavours being made to remove all the anchors and the riser turret moorings and chains. So towards the end of 2024, we're also planning the Minerva decommissioning campaign in Victoria and submitting the first decommissioning EP in Victorian state waters to be assessed by the Victorian regulator, DECA. So what role can research play in helping this work that's currently underway? So as I said, decommissioning is a new industry in Australia. It's a new skill set, and our work that we're doing is on the forefront of what's happening and planned for the next 5 to 10 years in Australia. It also means that we're learning a bit through doing. We're removing subsea equipment, taking it to shore and dismantling it. We're learning about the material used in these structures, the types of steel, the types of concrete, plastic, and how they have degraded in the marine environment. We're also learning about the fate and transport of contaminants, the ecotoxicity, the effectiveness of onshore cleaning practices. So all these learnings will help inform better environmental outcomes and build a bank of evidence for decommissioning in Australian waters. I think there's great benefit to title holders and operators working with groups like NDRI, IOGP and CODA. It allows industry players to collaborate in a way that's open and transparent and prioritise research in the area that's needed to answer the gaps and the questions that we have. It also allows us to build credible and defensible knowledge which is open and transparent to all. It also helps us understand how structures and platforms will degrade so that we can ensure there's plans in place to manage that structural integrity and ensure environmental impacts for the life of the structure are managed to acceptable and ALARP, so as low as reasonably practical. It also allows industry to develop strong partnerships by collaborating and partnering with research organisations, experts, industries and governments to share learnings on decommissioning. And so finally, I'm going to do just a small quick case study on Angel decommissioning study. So we've scoped and presented our plans for the Angel decommissioning study to NOPSEMA and have engaged AIMS to conduct this work. So we're understanding that with Angel, that research takes time, and it takes time to build that evidence base and to plug gaps in our knowledge. So we need to in order to build the appropriate evidence we need to start early, and while the asset is still in operation before end of field life. So we can obtain the knowledge we need to support these decisions, and that knowledge is around the impacts, the risks and the benefits of different decommissioning options. So for Angel, we're looking at understanding all the options for the platform and doing all the research we can now to inform an evidence-based decision on that one. So I guess from an operator's perspective, the key role of research is helping us to understand the regions and the environments in which we operate in and collect long-term defensible environment data. And this research will help us to conduct robust environmental impact assessments and implement management measures to eliminate or minimise environmental risks and impacts. I look forward to seeing how this research and others will help support good decision making and outcomes for decommissioning. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Steph, and lovely to learn a little bit about the case studies and how the research would benefit in that area. Now I'd like to welcome Darren Koppel to the stand, Australian Institute of Marine Science. He's a research scientist there and focuses on investigating contaminant impacts and the risks in the marine environment. So welcome, Darren.
Thank you, Renae, and thank you, CODA, for inviting me to speak at this conference and for this panel. I'm from the Australian Institute of Marine Science, and I'm specifically going to be talking about some of the challenges and progress that we've had trying to operationalise a risk assessment framework for Norman Mercury, specifically for those deviation cases where we're looking at residual levels of contaminants in infrastructure that title holders might want to explore leaving in the ocean at the end of its life. So AIMS is Australia's tropical research agency, tropical marine research agency, and our research provides that knowledge to support the sustainable management and protection of our marine ecosystems. Now, the key drivers for our research at the moment are something that Renae touched on about the stakeholder priorities. Contaminants are that number one priority for offshore decommissioning at the moment. And then the flip side of that is scientific uncertainty increases regulatory uncertainty, and under our ecologically sustainable development principles, necessitates decisions based on the precautionary principle. Now, contaminants are not new in the oil and gas industry. In fact, I'd say it's core business preventing pollution for oil and gas title holders. So what makes this different compared to some of those more routine assessments that are being conducted? As Stephanie said, decommissioning is new in Australia, and the contaminant assessment process is different for decommissioning than it is for something like routine marine operations or produced water. And some of those reasons include timeframes, and one of the key challenges we face is predicting long into the future what that exposure is going to be, because it's commensurate to the degradation of the material, because a lot of those contaminants are contained within the infrastructure. Another challenge has been defining what's required under the various bits of sometimes overlapping regulatory frameworks. And it's great having David to speak on some of those. A lot of movement happened in the previous 2 years, but it seems like that's resolved, and the expectations on title holders has also seemed to resolve. So I think we're at a good point to now move forward with research to support decommissioning decision making. So in research land, we often get asked the question, what is the threshold value for mercury, for norm? And what I interpret title holders to mean is, what is that numerical concentration below which we can be reasonably confident that we can take a case to the regulator to say that we will meet our environmental protection requirements. Now, the simplicity of a threshold value belies the complexity of the data needed to ensure it's robust and then could be operationalized in a regulatory framework. And that's the challenge we face for decommissioning. Norm and mercury, if released to the marine environment, have a number of credible potential impacts that can have a range of impacts to marine users. Not just toxicity, which is what our existing sediment and water quality guidelines protect against, but also long-term contamination, so looking at intergenerational equity challenges, but also biomagnification in our food web, so impacts to recreational and commercial fishes. And the challenge is that's often dependent on the local environment. So I've framed this in a knowledge iceberg for a bit of a tired metaphor. But at the bottom of this iceberg is that fundamental science, those research papers that provide the case describing all of these interrelationships between the release and the environment and the receptors that makes for a robust guideline, that makes for a robust threshold values. And one of the challenges we face is that the Gippsland Basin is going to be quite different to the Bonaparte Basin, to the Carnarvon Basin. So this has to have some degree of site specificity to reflect the local receiving environment. Diving into mercury a bit more, if you think about the release of mercury in a decommissioning scenario, mercury will end up in the sediment because it's in a solid form. There's a range of chemical and microbiological interactions that will occur connecting that release to the food web. And we're just looking at one impact here, which is that biomagnification. Each of those steps is important in defining what that ultimate impact will be. And we don't have a good comprehensive understanding of those processes to a degree that we can confidently predict what that impact will be from the release. So without understanding each of these steps, the nuances of each individual basin, the sediment properties, the local microbial composition and activity, and the local food webs, we can't develop those shortcuts, which is what the threshold value is, connecting the release to the impact. Just to highlight some of the challenges that we have globally around this with some case studies. The most famous mercury pollution event was the Minamata Bay disaster, where about 27 tons was discharged over about 30 years through this channel shown here into Minamata Bay. That led to quite widespread human health as well as environmental health negative outcomes, including the emergence of methyl mercury poisoning, which later became known as Minamata disease, and then that incident became the namesake of the Minamata Convention on Mercury. A little closer to home, looking at another industrial discharge event, this time in Albany, so Princess Royal Harbour. About 500 kilograms, again over about a 30-year period, resulted in elevations in fish tissue concentrations of mercury that led to a closure of that harbour for fishing for over a decade. A bit different, about 67-ton payload of mercury was spilled from this U-boat 864, a German submarine, off the coast of Norway. Some 70 years later, the impacts to the food web there have been quite minimal, to be honest, so we're not seeing that biomagnification in the food web from that case. And then a more recent example, at least in literature, was the 16th century shipwreck in the Azores, so just northwest of North Africa, where an unknown amount of mercury was being transported. The ship sunk, and 500 years later, they're still recovering elemental mercury, so shown in the photo there. Also looking at still seeing elevations in fish tissue concentrations and some of those marine organisms in the nearby environment, so that long-term impact is demonstrated there. I stole this risk-related decision-making framework from OG UK, one of their technical advice documents. I know you can't read it, so I just pulled out some of the key points that I thought were relevant to offshore decommissioning contaminant assessments. From my point of view, and this is my opinion, decisions about mercury and norm are still squarely in this type C column. But the work we're doing with NDRI is trying to push decisions one step to the left, where we can demonstrate that risks are amenable to assessment. So that's some of the work that we're doing with NDRI in collaboration with the Australian Nuclear Science and Technology Organisation. And it's wonderful having the support of some of the key regulators and good engagement from them in helping to advise the development of an assessment framework that, if nothing else, will also provide the types of investigations that operators and title holders can start to undertake to support that decision making, even if we can't go all the way and develop a threshold value with the information we have at this stage. So this is my last slide. There's a number of hurdles to address. One of the key ones for us is always funding. We operate on a polluter pays system in Australia, so the Australian government isn't going to be funding the type of research to support title holder deviation cases. But there's a lot of low-hanging fruit that I think is really amenable to a collective effort, and NDRI is a great vehicle, I think, to achieve that. And I know that I'm not an impartial observer here because I am a researcher, and a researcher asking for research funds is nothing new. But NOPSEMA put out a fantastic research strategy, so if nothing else, you can just fund that, and I think will go some way in reducing that scientific uncertainty and therefore the regulatory uncertainty. And with that, I'll say thank you, and please provide some questions for the panel.
Thank you, Darren. And now we'll just move into the panel session. So I'd like to invite all the speakers up to the front, and I'll open with some suggested questions, but then we'll open to the audience as well. So thank you. Thank you. Thank you all for joining me up here at the front. So some great talks across a range of disciplines, and I'm really pleased that you could be here today to join me, and I think there will be some great questions from the audience. But I'd like to open with a question to you first, David. Can you just tell us a little bit more about the newly released compliance strategy and research strategies and some of the key changes that might be important for people listening?
Yeah, great. Can do. So NOPSEMA has been implementing a decommissioning compliance strategy for the last couple of years. As I mentioned during the presentation, we recently updated that with the lessons learned and the experience that we've had from the last couple of years. So just highlight some of the key changes with that. So we still have a mission statement, which is pretty straightforward, ensuring the timely, safe and environmental responsible decommissioning of petroleum facilities. What we've done is enhance the use of our targets. We've set some targets for industry to decommission their assets within 12 months of ceasing production to remove buoyant infrastructure, 3 years to plug wells and 5 years to remove all remaining infrastructure. As I said, the premise there is that we know the longer the period between COP and decommissioning, the greater the risk. We've actually then also enhanced the targets around progressive decommissioning of assets. Our view is that, again, in terms of managing risks, it's better to progressively decommissioning your assets. So if wells aren't needed and they're suspended, well then think to decommission those proactively. Likewise with production systems as well, rather than waiting until complete end of field life for that particular asset. The last change really is just around how we use our compliance enforcement tools. As I said, the general directions have been very effective, but there is some consequences of using tools such as that. And we really want to incentivise and promote good planning by petroleum companies. So we've just changed slightly the way in which we'll use our tools. So if a company, for example, is done all the necessary planning and is well placed to go into decommission, then they won't necessarily obviously get a general direction. So they're probably the key changes with the compliance strategy. Obviously it's available on our website, and encourage all petroleum companies to download it, because it does give you a good indication of the likely approach NOPSEMA will be taken for your assets based on the risk profile of your activities. The research strategy, thanks for the plug, Darren. A lot of work was put into that from the team. That essentially is intending to provide groups such as Darren's AIMS and others insights into where we see research gaps, where we see gaps in the science that has led to then challenges with actually progressing approvals for environmental management. Covers a whole range of different topics, but there is a section specifically aimed at decommissioning, and a big focus on fate consequence of contaminants, which is something for petroleum companies to keep in mind, regardless of end states proposed. There is an expectation that there is a sound understanding of sediment quality, and it's important that petroleum companies think about that, particularly during the operational phase of their activities, to inform the title surrender process. So thank you.
Thanks, David. So yeah, also that underlying message there, early planning and gathering that base knowledge. And you touched on looking at alternatives from the title holders. What are some of the key tips or suggestions you would give to the title holders under these newly revised strategies to seek decommissioning alternatives, and how to engage NOPSEMA on that?
Yeah, I guess to sound like a bit of a broken record, plan early. With that, I guess three key elements that I see as crucial for success if a company wishes to seek this alternative. The first is to understand that environmental value proposition, and then to start collecting the necessary data to support that case. The second is to understand your community, understand key stakeholders, understand their views and perspectives, and ideally consider partnerships with them as well, if that's going to be supporting your case. And then thirdly, think about arrangements you can put in place to manage that low-level risk that will be present. So things like fishing hazards or other things, and this is probably really where the pinch point has been with the current cases that we've seen, is that there isn't a great mechanism to deal with those sorts of things, these low-level risks associated with leaving property in situ. So companies have to really start thinking creatively about how they can address those gaps. Be it through some sort of funding mechanism or some other way to deal with things for this long-term timescale that we're talking about.
Okay, great. And then you're touching on that timescale. I think that's probably coming through in all the messaging, is looking at that long-term fate for contaminants, but also the degradation and structural integrity of some of the alternatives as well, and looking at that. So I'd like to move over to Darren now. And we've highlighted contaminants, in particular norms and mercury, as a priority. In your opinion, what other areas of research should be prioritised for Australia or globally?
I think one of the key concerns that are emerging from the Australian government and also, I suppose, stakeholders in the community are around plastics. So that's maybe an under-addressed topic at the moment, and that's something that there's a lot of movement in the international forum. So we're looking at a plastics treaty coming online. They're looking at developing a science policy panel for chemicals, waste and the prevention of pollution. So a lot more international coordination and oversight about what types of chemicals are being released to the environment beyond these contaminant-specific treaties that we have, such as Minamata Convention. So I think some effort around the acceptability of leaving plastics will be one of the key requirements.
Thank you. And would you say building these types of frameworks, like with the norms and mercury, would be beneficial in the plastic space as well?
Absolutely, and I think that's where research can really help. There's a lot of uncertainty around what happens to different contaminants when they're in the environment. It's all very dependent on their chemistry as well as the local receiving environment. So research can help map that out, look at the causal pathways from release to impact, And from that type of a framework, we can start drawing what type of assessments operators and title holders can start undertaking to inform risk.
Thank you very much. Now, I'll throw to Steph now. Looking at the title holders' experience around recent decommissioning, what have you seen has been the key challenges there, and where has that sort of research aspect come in, or in terms of planning to collect some of this information to support your assessments?
Yeah, and I guess a lot of it comes into the time you have to plan, and a lot of additional things have come up with environmental approvals and getting those hurdles through, and engaging with traditional owners and doing that community consultation. That's the areas where we've seen taken longer. So getting the environmental approvals in place has taken longer. So then we're getting the approvals as we're doing the work, which then means you're not planned for the work ahead. So there is a bit of a backlog at the moment, and something we're trying to work through so that then we have a bit more time to do the research that we need to make the cases and make the right decisions, and get that planned well in ahead as we keep talking through early planning.
And how are you capturing some of the learnings from these current projects to feed into the next ones that are coming off the back of that?
Yeah, I think it would be good for this, because we've got a lot of subsea infrastructure that we're doing at the moment. The next bunch of work will be on pipelines, and we don't know much about pipelines, so I think that's a big area, and is it 3,000, 5,000 kilometres of pipelines in Australia that we need to work out what we need to do with. Another area that we're still working through is sea dumping permits as well. And so what may get approved, we then need to make sure we meet our international obligations and the London Protocol and getting our approvals through sea dumping. So this, whilst it's a new decommissioning space, it's also kind of a new approval space that we need to understand what evidence and research we need to provide.
Okay, great. Well, that leads me into another question. Are you able to expand a little bit more on the new guideline that's coming out around the collaborative effort to refine some of that guidance?
Yeah, I am. It's obviously still under lock and key, given the ministers haven't signed it off, but I'll just explain the concept behind it. It essentially is an effort by government, so ourselves, DQ Sea Dumping team and DISA, to set some very clear parameters about what infrastructure needs to be removed in all cases. And I don't think it will come now, 3 years on from when we sort of started really the decommissioning journey, I think, in Australia, as much of a surprise in terms of the types of property, the class of property that we're talking about that needs to be removed in all cases. But it'll be setting a very clear expectation for title holders, so then they're better informed as it comes to planning. And then it'll outline a class of property where cases may be made and some considerations for title holders to think about in putting forward a case for that particular proposal. In terms of those considerations, again, I don't think it's going to come as a surprise in terms of the sorts of things, fate consequence of contaminants associated with the infrastructure, the environmental impacts to other, or impacts I should say, to other marine users now and into the future, and a range of other considerations as well.
Okay, thanks for the insight into that, David. So I think for those stakeholders who are interested in that and commenting on that, you're saying it's coming out in April?
Yeah, pending sign-off. Likely in the next month or so, and will obviously be put out widely from the three different organisations there, and I understand DISA will be holding some information sessions on it as well, and it will be a period of public comment, so obviously people are welcome to provide their input, but I just would say I certainly don't think it's going to necessarily be the silver bullet in addressing uncertainty. I think we'll certainly still see some large aspects of uncertainty that need to be addressed.
Absolutely, but keep an eye out for that if you wanted to provide some early input. Now, I might take this opportunity to throw to the floor while we've got 10 minutes left. Is there any burning questions out there you want to ask any of our panel people? Yes, I'll just come to...
Thanks very much for the presentations. I'm Paul Gordon. We specialise in decision making, so this is perfect for us. I guess a question for, and I know it's going to be tempting for everyone to pepper you, David, with all the questions, right? You're the evil regulator in the room, and we're all trying to do anyway. But my question is the challenge of research funded by the title holders in support of, they're trying to prove their case against what might be the base case. So what's your view on where the research is done and how it's funded in terms of, I guess, giving you what you need to be able to sit back and go, no, we can see this on balance?
No, great question. And I think the key mechanism we've used for that is development of this research strategy, where we've outlined where we see there are needs to inform then decision making. So NOPSEMA is we're a fully cost recovered regulatory agency, pretty small agency, everything sort of built on the levy construct that we've got with petroleum companies who essentially have to pay to be able to have assessments performed, undertake ongoing compliance monitoring. So most of our costs are to give to regulatory staff, employee expensive. We don't actually have a big kitty of cash that we can splash around. So the best mechanism we've got is through developing things like this research strategy where we identify and communicate gaps, and then liaising with the likes of NDRI, other research organisations as well, and contribute and provide our perspective as an end user of some of these things.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any more questions from the floor?
Yeah. My name is Muhammad Shahzad Hussain from University of Western Australia. Question to you, David, again. That you are saying that Australian government is now thinking to develop a guideline for decommissioning. So why not before? Have not we thought that it is coming?
Yeah, so the Australian government has guidance that's publicly available. It's out. What we've done recently, though, is develop guidance from multiple different regulators who are administering pieces of legislation. So this is what I'm referring to here. This is trying to provide the Australian government's perspectives from the two different regulators, DQ and NOPSEMA, as it relates to sea dumping permits and approvals to leave stuff in situ. The Australian government guidance on decommissioning, which I think, Darren, you had on your slide pack there, that's been available since I think 2019 and does set some very clear expectations of petroleum companies in terms of base case full removal, ensuring all decommissioning completed before title surrender, etc.
Can I ask one more question? This question is to Steph. Steph, the decommissioning thing, is that for end of life or we are shifting to new energy?
Maybe don't quite understand the question. So the case study I provided was on a platform that is nearing end of life, but we're doing the research ahead of the operation while it's still in production, so it's not associated with new energy.
No, overall, I'm saying that overall, we are talking about decommissioning now. So is that for end of life decommissioning, or you are thinking that we may need to switch to new energy system, so we may need to stop in here and then move to new energy?
Yeah, I think carbon capture storage is being talked about here today and yesterday. It's an area that people are looking into and operators are keeping that door open. But we are still needing to plan for decommissioning, and we need to meet our requirements under NOPSEMA's compliance strategy of plugging wells between 3 years and removing property within 5. Is that right? Yep.
Thank you. And maybe one more question from the floor, perhaps for Darren. Anyone? No takers? Okay. Well, I've got a couple more questions here while we've got some more time. Can you, Steph, talk about how the key learnings from Griffin are perhaps going to influence the work on the Angel platform, for example?
Yeah, so we're only just starting to collect samples from the pipeline to understand what contaminants are there. And so I think that research in the future will help us to understand how well we are able to clean it and really inform the strategy for other pipelines that we own. and other decommissioning that's coming up. So there'll be some really good learnings from the project. We've only just literally pulled it out of the water. We've now got to understand, and we've got quite a bit of time to dismantle that and get all the waste broken down.
And NDRI are waiting with bated breath to sort of, do that knowledge transfer across the different operators as well and to the regulators. And for Darren, can you talk a little bit more about the approach to this current work that you're doing with NDRI and how it's a little bit different about the engagement with the independent advisory group and the support there?
Yeah, sure. So AIMS and ANSA are working together with NDRI on a project that's trying to consolidate guidance on Norman Mercury risk assessments for leave in situ decommissioning cases. And one of the challenges that we're trying to overcome is there's an amount of research that's already in the field, and it's not really operational in a way that can be applied in an assessment framework at this stage. So we're trying to juggle that. We're also trying to juggle what we think the expectations of the regulatory frameworks are as they relate to Norman Mercury being left in the marine environment. And they're sometimes conflicting, sometimes different interpretations of what acceptable is and who defines acceptability. There's some pretty prescriptive requirements, there's some pretty non-prescriptive outcomes-based requirements. So it's about taking the work that's already out there through NDRI Phase 1, identifying how we can best operationalize it and align it to the regulatory requirements that we think will allow title holders to have the information to make those decisions about what's best for their infrastructure. And we're doing that using an independent advisory group. So, one of the challenges that we face at AIMS quite regularly is ensuring that we are a trusted advisor to government, to industry, to the community as well. So using an independent advisory group that has some of the key regulators, that has independent scientists, means that there is that arm's distance from direct industry engagement when coming up with an assessment framework. Now, we also work quite closely with industry, helping them meet specific regulatory requirements. But in this case, having them support NDRI but still be an arm's distance means that we can ensure that independence of the advice that comes through. Yeah.
Thank you for that summary. And I think it's probably important to note, to come back to, this guidelines like this aren't going to be a silver bullet. I mean, it's still early days. It'll still evolve. It might just provide more context for your site-specific assessments for each project, because the aspects that are being inputted into those assessment tools will vary considerably. So it's about the application of these and testing it through that EP process. I just wanted to also touch on, thank you for mentioning the new energy transition. How do you think some of the information from this decommissioning research and the guidance that's developed can support other industries such as offshore wind and onshore decommissioning, for that matter? Throw it to the floor to anyone who wants to answer that.
I'll have a first stab on behalf of some of my colleagues at AIMS that do a lot of the ecological value research. So there's a team at AIMS that looks at what types of organisms use offshore infrastructure, how they relate to the natural surrounding environments, natural reefs, what their connectivity is and role within those ecosystems. And the learnings that come from decommissioning offshore oil and gas infrastructure are directly applicable to the decommissioning case for offshore energy, which is, maybe 30, 40, 50 years into the future. So forming this evidence base now is going to serve us well long into the future around, do we establish artificial reefs? Is, leave in situ as an abandonment case, as good for the environment as maybe modifications and augmentation? So a lot of those types of questions, the research we're doing now will directly feed into.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd like to add to that sort of material selection and how it's retrieved as well is a big consideration, I think, for decommissioning of this other infrastructure in future. And we've only got another minute or so left, so I'd like to just ask all three of you to sort of summarise a key message you would like to convey and leave with us today from your presentation today. So start with Steph.
Yeah, I think the early planning one's coming through loud and strong, but also the role of research and understanding the environments we're in, and understanding the property also and what it's made up of that's in the tidal areas. So it's really building that understanding.
I'll echo early planning. Research takes a long time, and developing the research capacity also takes time, so there isn't much of a research workforce for some of those contaminants like norm and mercury. And then secondly, embrace uncertainty. We're going to have to live with uncertainty, particularly in contaminant assessments. I think the regulators are smart enough to be able to interpret uncertainty and understand that as part of a case to them. So don't try and minimize that, try and embrace that, try and understand it and quantify it as best as possible.
Yeah, good point. I guess, sticking with that theme of early planning, I'd probably just advocate consider the community, particularly petroleum companies, to understand who are their stakeholders, other marine users, First Nation groups and individuals, and build that relationship with them early is what I'd be advocating as well.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to wrap it up there. Thank you so much for joining me up here today. I really appreciate the insights from all perspectives. I think it's been really valuable, and I'd like to thank everyone. If you could give them a round of applause, and thank you very much.